Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight for a very special presentation by Diana West, who will be speaking on her new book, American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character. Her book has made such an impact that she has made several TV appearances, including book TV, interview, and personal appearances, and today on Glenn Beck. There have been a multitude of raving reviews, one of which was written by my friend Mark Tapson, which is available as a handout tonight. Diana West is a distinguished conservative author and nationally syndicated columnist. She takes in American Betrayal, she takes a deeper look at America's historical record, uncovering a body of lies that Americans have been led to regard as near sacred history of World War II and its Cold War aftermath. Part real-life thriller, part national tragedy, American Betrayal lights up the massive Moscow-directed penetration of America's most hallowed halls of power. As Mark Tapson states, American Betrayal is an eye-opening, unsettling read, but it is also a call to action to upend the manipulated narrative, break open the conspiracies of silence, and avenge the American betrayal of liberty herself. And now it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Diana West.
I thank you all for coming. I'm very happy to be speaking here. I am actually from Los Angeles, not too far away. I grew up in Laurel Canyon, so this is a homecoming of sorts. And it is with great pleasure, I bring you a very depressing story, but one also I think that is potentially very inspiring. I was inspired even as I was depressed, which may sound like a strange combination, but this is the process of discovery and recovery. And I would like to begin by warning everyone in the room that this book actually does ask a lot of readers in terms of rethinking what we know about our past, what we intuitively know, what we think about when we think back on the past century in particular. It turns out, and this is something that Doris was alluding to, that what we know, what we intuit about ourselves is in fact a series of big lies. Many of them, not everything, but a great deal of what we know. And now we associate big lies, the very term, with totalitarianism. We associate it, of course, with Stalin, who originated the notion of a big lie. In other words, a lie that would be spread, particularly with this new thing, new in the 20th century, of mass media. And if you say it often enough, people believe it. And of course, Adolf Hitler, his pupil, took this to very famous. Can everyone hear me? Oh, I thought someone said no. Took this to new heights as well. So the fact is, though, that we tell them as well. And some of them are very easy to spot because we've discarded them. For example, Uncle Joe Stalin was a good guy. Now, Uncle Joe, of course, is in quotation marks, but this was the very grating nickname that FDR and Churchill gave to Joseph Stalin, one of the mass murderers of all time, who was our ally, of course, during World War II. This was a big lie. He was not a good fellow, and yet this was what the American people were told for years, and this was what the British people as well. This was part of a concerted propaganda effort, a series of big lies that were told during World War II in this alliance, that it even went so far as to have President Roosevelt declare to the American people that there was complete freedom of religion in the Soviet Union under their constitution. Another lie. Now, other big lies are easy to spot because we still tell them. For example, Islam is a religion of peace. That's a laugh line, right? But this is what we've been told. I mean, here we are, we get hit on 9/11, and the President of the United States, the next day pretty much, starts to tell us that Islam is a religion of peace. And for the next decade, actually more than a decade by now, every fact that is permitted, promoted, sanctioned in the public square, and by that I would mean what politicians say in public, what pundits say, what people write about, what they talk about without fear, is supposed to support this notion, which is illogical. It makes no sense. And when I started the research for this book, I was actually very interested in solving this riddle of how we could be saddled with this big lie. And as a journalist, I write a weekly newspaper column, so I'm very, very much in touch with what the freight will bear, what language is permissible, what people are saying, what they are not saying. But it became very clear after 9/11 that it was really impossible for our society to be facing just the facts about Islam, about jihad, about Sharia, Islamic law, about dhimmitud, of course, being the condition of non-Muslims under Islamic law, the very suppressed and repressed culture. These are the subjects that actually drew me after 9/11 in my own inquiries and understanding and trying to understand our world after 9/11. And I became particularly attuned to the inability of getting such facts discussed, addressed in the corridors of power, on television, and so on. So when I began this book, I was actually looking to understand this better. I was hoping to understand it. In some ways, my first book, The Death of the Grown-Up, was looking at this same syndrome, but it wasn't enough just to say people weren't grown up enough. It seemed like there was more to that, just to a metaphor. And I started looking for a precedent in our past for this really institutional failure in society to confront the threat to liberty. Was there a precedent for telling lies, for totalitarian-style big lies in our society? And what I understood at a certain point, that I was really examining more the perversion of logic as much as the loss of courage. In other words, to insist that Islam is a religion of peace is to be highly illogical and, as I would soon understand, also highly ideological. Now, anyone who was not abiding by these rules right from the start was branded an Islamophobe. And this became this irrational kind of magic totem, almost from primitive times where people had tremendous senses of taboos. Islamophobe, and you would poof, disappear essentially in terms of your career or in terms of your place on a TV spot or whatever it is. And I realized as I was doing this research that this was very similar to another word that used to shut people up, and that word was red baiter. So some generations ago we had red baiter, and that stopped the conversation, put the person on the defensive. Now we have Islamophobe. In 1938, I found that a man named J.B. Matthews, who was an ex-socialist at this point, he was a very learned man, a tremendous scholar, a socialist of note, but he had left the left, he had abandoned socialism, and indeed he would actually go on to work for Senator Joseph McCarthy at a certain point. He wrote about this phenomenon of red baiting, and he said that red baiting was the best trick ever invented, short of a firing squad, for making short work of anybody who dares to object to communist theories and practices. If he is not effectively silenced, he is at least thoroughly discredited among the vast flock of citizens who enjoy thinking of themselves as liberals. This, of course, you just change the word red baiting to Islamophobe, and we have the same phenomenon today. And herein I decided I had found a common thread in ideology. Islam, while a religion, is also a collectivist and totalitarian ideology that is at odds with rule of law-based liberty. Communism, which has always inspired a religious devotion in its followers, is also a collectivist and totalitarian ideology at odds with rule of law-based liberty. Not to acknowledge these facts, is in a sense to serve these ideologies, to protect them, to allow them to advance in such a way as not to alarm people, take people off their guard, take people their minds off the need to defend liberty. There's no difference. This is fine. It keeps moving. So the less you tell the truth, the more these ideologies advance. And I began to discover, as I was, again, looking for precedent, because honestly, I started this research not really knowing what I would find. And I began to discover in my research, much to my amazement, that during World War II, the United States government embarked on a campaign to whitewash communism that is uncannily similar to what the US government did after 9/11 to whitewash Islam. So in a sense, you're looking at, what's going on here? A cover-up of reality. And in both cases, in order to serve these ideological ends. And so in many ways, this is where the thematic structure of my book comes from. It's kind of a new way to approach the history of the last century, not as we always do in terms of a struggle between communism and the free world, but as a struggle between the forces of concealment and the forces of exposure. And I would like to just read one paragraph from the book, because it kind of sets up, I call it the beginning. It is a beginning. You could start probably at several points, but I think in terms of trying to set up this notion of concealment and exposure, I think this is a very good beginning to understand that. Sometime in 1934, two men got off separate trains at Union Station in Washington, D.C. They had arrived in the nation's capital to fight on different sides of a war. It was a war few Americans knew, or even now know, was raging all around the capital. One man, in his early 30s, had come to expand the reach of the secret communist apparatus already entrenched inside the US government. The other man, age 60, had come to expose it. The name of the younger man was Whittaker Chambers. He would later become the most famous ex-communist to bear witness to the conspiracy he had served. The older man, William A. Wurt, would die in obscurity. And this is essentially a pattern that would be repeated throughout the decades. What happened, we know quite a bit, most of us know quite a bit about what happened to Whittaker Chambers. William A. Wurt came to Washington to testify on the Hill about a dinner party that he had actually been invited to at the end of 1933, at which he heard revolution discussed and plotted by New Dealers, mid-level people, people working in the government who knew more important people, and were discussing what they were hearing in terms of a complete overthrow of the pre-existing state, what I think he referred to it as the Washington, or the America of Washington and Jefferson, and discussions of the planned economy that was coming into place and the collectivization actually of people and so on. It went on with the sort of the Soviet program that at that point was very much in vogue. And he was so perturbed that he had sounded the alarm and ended up by hook and crook in hearings. But what we understand from later revelations by actually one of the participants in these hearings, this was actually the first American show trial. I think it is actually the first American show trial. The point of the hearings in this Democrat-controlled Congress was to shut down William Wurt and to discredit him. And the way they did that was they did not allow him to have counsel, contrary to the tradition. They did not allow him to read a statement, contrary to the Senate and House tradition. Oh, thank you, sweetie. They did not give him the opportunity to call witnesses. They did not give him the opportunity to cross-examine the witnesses who were there. And who were they? They were the other dinner party guests. And the other dinner party guests had all, we found out later, gotten together and set up a story that essentially said, William Wurt never stopped talking, we couldn't get a word in edgewise, much less plan a revolution, and he became a laughingstock. And even the President of the United States made fun of him. I mean, it went all the way down. It was across the news and so on. Later on, we actually find out that one of the Democrats on this kangaroo court fessed up in a mea culpa after William Wurt died, and this was published in many newspapers, and he was bearing his public sorrow and his shame for having, quote, turned the screws on Dr. Wurt. Later, and he discussed the fact that these witnesses had colluded in terms of trying to shut the story down. Later, much later, we find out that 3 out of the other 6 guests at this dinner party were actually Soviet agents and collaborators, including the hostess, who was a very noted KGB spy. They appear in archives such as the Winona archives, which I will discuss. And as Representative John D. O'Connor, who had written this mea culpa, said, William Wurt was right. He believed he was right, and he was, tremendously sorry for what he had done. So we have this vignette of exposure and concealment. Whittaker Chambers, that day, he came to Washington. He met his new agent, who was going to be opening a cell at the State Department. His name was Alger Hiss. William Wurt trying to raise his hand up and say, look what's going on, America. Smashed. So then we say, well, who won when we look back on all this? And I personally think it's quite clear that the communist conspirators won in terms of keeping the extent and implications of this communist conspiracy a secret. For example, we all know, at this point, I think everyone practically agrees and understands the evidence tells us Alger Hiss was an arch-Soviet agent. Almost everyone still will admit that at this point. It's pretty much redundantly confirmed. But do we ever think about the fact that Alger Hiss oversaw the formation of the United Nations? No, he was the first Secretary General at the San Francisco Conference. He was shepherding the whole formation throughout. He did many other things, but that is a very stark one that we don't think about, even as we look back over decades of talking about how anti-American the United Nations is. We don't make these connections, and I think that there are reasons for this, and this is part of what I set out to explore. Do we ever think about that the arch-Soviet spy, again redundantly confirmed, Harry Dexter White, a very senior Treasury official, do we ever think he oversaw the formation essentially of the global economy, IMF, World Bank? These are huge buildings in the center of Washington across from the White House. Do we ever think that a Soviet agent essentially designed the modern world? Two of them, between the UN and the international economy. I mean, this is big stuff. In a sense, our enemies designed the world. And so we wonder why we are now looking at increasing movement toward all manner of socialist policies. Why don't we think about this? What are these blanks in our memory, our understanding about? I think they make our claims of victory in the Cold War quite problematic. Anyone who's gone to college with an attachment to the Constitution and free markets knows that most campuses in this country are essentially outposts of Marx. We can think about Elizabeth Bentley. She was a very famous American spy for Stalin who turned to the FBI and brought news of about 140 American traitors who were either flat-out agents or collaborators for Stalin and our government. At this rate, hell will freeze over before she gets a statue at her alma mater, which is also Hillary Clinton's alma mater, Vassar. What kind of victory is that? The people who made it possible or made something possible are spurned. And this is what I was coming to, is going back in time, was the fact that the truth tellers, the people who were always trying to expose the conspiracy at different times, this very dirty intelligence war against our country always became objects of derision and scorn. Toxic, absolutely untouchable. And of course, that's true today in our current situation. And I would say that these truth tellers, in many ways, are the core, I would say the inspirational core of what is, frankly, a very dark tale, this book. But they have been essentially paved over and forgotten by most people in this country. And I was very thrilled to discover people I had never heard of before myself and give them a place in this book. Besides William Wurt, I would include, for example, Major George Racy Jordan, who gave sworn testimony in 1949 and 1950 regarding the shipment of uranium and heavy water to the Soviet Union during World War II at a time when the Manhattan Project was the biggest secret we had, or so we thought. And he also is the only American to bear witness to what is arguably the treason of President Roosevelt's closest aide, Harry Hopkins, who he believed was behind this drive. Very compellingly so, because Harry Hopkins was essentially the designer of this massive funding program and military supply program known as Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union in particular. You also have Julius Epstein, who was a refugee from Hitler-occupied Austria, who came to this country and became a great journalist. And after World War II, it was he who set the record straight on what we know as the Katyn Forest Massacre, which took place early in World War II, where some 20,000 Polish officers, reservists, were murdered. And the Germans were blamed. The Soviets blamed the Germans. The Germans discovered the grave. The Nazis discovered the graves. And they didn't do it. They blamed the Soviets. Stalin did do it. However, despite evidence that was available at the time, both Roosevelt and Churchill threw in their lot with Stalin and essentially lied for him and with him and maintained that, yes, this was a German war crime. Julius Epstein did enough reporting after the war to trigger House hearings about 1949, 1950, and they were significant enough and set the record compellingly straight enough that the US government finally officially acknowledged this as a Soviet crime, and I think it was 8 years. That was a long time for the US government to lie about that. He also did tremendous reporting on something many Americans have no idea about, something, if Katyn was a lie that America and Britain told with Stalin, this was actually actual collusion and involvement in a war crime, crime against humanity, I'm sure. Operation Keelhaul, which was the repatriation of some 2 million Soviet-claimed nationals who'd become refugees in the western part of Europe. The only way Stalin could get his hands on them was for American and British forces to return them by force, very often in the most violent, horrifying extremis of these people who often killed themselves without really having anything to kill themselves with, rather than be returned. But some 2 million were returned, and Julius Epstein followed this story and in about 1973 published his book, Operation Keelhaul. Now, when I set out to write this, I did not imagine that I would be following this line of research that was so devastating to our notions of particularly World War II, which we do regard with great pride, and of course, the heroism of our people, of our men in uniform, and our population that sacrificed so much, and that is not an issue. That is not part of what I'm looking at. I am looking at the American betrayal of our leaders. And this is the story that has not been told. And I would just also add that I say this as the daughter of a veteran of World War II. My late father, Elliot West, walked ashore onto a pacified Omaha beach on D-Day +2, and he would be wounded at the Battle of Saint-Lô and come out of battle and be returned to battle and end up right across the German line in a beautiful little town called Monschau, which I actually visited a few years ago. It looks like a Grimm's fairy tale kind of village, and I doubt he ever actually got inside, because I think he would have mentioned it. But he was still wearing his summer uniform from Normandy. It was getting to be cold and snowy in the German forest. He got very ill, high temperature. At a certain point, your temperature's high enough, they pull you off the line, and not long after that, what we know as the Battle of the Bulge began, and those very frontline German positions of our forces suffered huge casualties. And so frankly, if he had not gotten ill, I probably would not be here talking about it. But I mention these two particular battles because they bookend my father's war. And one of the many controversial things that I argue in my book is that perhaps they were not necessary. Perhaps D-Day, perhaps the Battle of the Bulge did not have to happen. And I say that looking at the implications, the effect of the communist occupation of Washington, D.C. We're not talking about one Aldrich Ames or 5 Cambridge spies led by Kim Philby. We're talking about hundreds, and some of them very highly placed in the White House, in the OSS, which is the precursor to CIA, in the media, in the various departments, state, treasury, and so on. They affected our policy, and this, again, is the story that we have not been told. This is the story that has been kept from us, that is in the records. I didn't have to do anything but uncover it. It's there, the books, the memoirs, and so on. Now, had those battles not happened, and this is a very upsetting notion, a very controversial notion, we might have had a much shorter war. What was going on that might have helped? Might. I say might. I'm not saying this is a sure thing. You had a significant anti-Hitler German resistance. Now, this is something we don't learn about, we don't know about, I didn't know about. When I saw Valkyrie with Tom Cruise, I think that was probably most people's first inkling that there was such a thing, and I think probably some people thought it was made up because it doesn't compute. But when I was going back through the records, I found multiple, in different places, movements, feelers coming out to Britain, to America, from these people, some of whom were very highly placed, including the intelligence chief, Admiral Canaris. And they would be stopped at some point, and what I was able to do in some cases was track where it stopped. And sometimes I found a Soviet agent, and I'll give you an example. Louis Lochner was an American bureau chief for AP in Berlin in the 1930s. He came back to America in 1942 with a secret message from a German Prince Louis Ferdinand, who was a mutual friend of Lochner's and President Roosevelt. And what he was trying to do was establish relations, establish secret codes, give him instructions, say, if you could talk about a Germany after Hitler, he had all kinds of things he wanted to do. He wanted the White House to start cooperating with whatever his group was. And Lochner, it was a very significant message from a significant German to the president. He was blocked. He could not get through to the White House. He was actually told, this is embarrassing by whoever this person was, stop calling. They told the AP Bureau to tell the bureau chief from Berlin to stop trying to reach the White House. I mean, it's fairly dramatic. And I'm reading about this, and I'm thinking, gosh, it'd be so amazing to know who is this. And I look in the footnote to this book that I cite, and the footnote, the book was written in about 1969-70, and the footnote tells us that the person who wrote this letter saying, stop calling the White House, it's getting embarrassing, was a man named Lachlan Curry. Lachlan Curry, we know, post-Soviet archives and so on, was a straight-up confirmed Soviet agent. So the buck stopped with the Soviet agent, Lachlan Curry was one of President Roosevelt's top aides. That's very disturbing, but it's not the only incident. I found several of these. I go through them in the book and lay out as much evidence as I was able to find because they're so compelling. You had in 1943, you had one of the people I call my truth tellers, George Earl. He had been a New Deal governor of Pennsylvania, a very enthusiastic friend of Roosevelt's. Roosevelt sent him as an emissary, they were close, sent him as an emissary to European capitals and so on. He was quite a guy. I actually think it's possible that the scene in Casablanca where they have the battle of the national anthems, where La Marseillaise is played over the objections of the Nazis, may have come from something that George Earl did, which was when he was in, I think it was Sofia, Bulgaria, in a bar with Germans. He didn't like them at all. They were Nazis, and it was still that Bulgaria was not involved at that point. And he started playing Tipperary. He asked the band to please play Tipperary, the noted World War I song, marching song. And the Germans got very upset and wanted it stopped, and they had a thing. And it was reported in the papers that George Earl beamed the Nazi officer with a champagne bottle. So he became very notorious, or famous, not notorious, but delightfully famous for that. I always wondered if maybe that ended up in the movie in a slightly different form. But anyway, George Earl had several of these feelers coming to him from Canaris first. He pushed it to the White House, nothing. From von Papen, another German very high-level diplomat, nothing. And what you don't know why, and you're reading about this, and you're thinking, this is so strange. And then I was trying to unravel this, and at some point, I was looking at Harry Hopkins' archives, which are in Washington at the Georgetown University, and I found that there was a folder of George Earl's correspondence to Hopkins from 1943. So excited, I'm going to find the secret. I get to the librarian, the archivist, brings me the folder, I open it up, empty. Now, this is not uncommon. I go through this in the book as well. Our archives are Swiss cheese. This was the first time it really happened to me in terms of going and getting the letters gone. But I did find, out of sequence, a letter Earl had written to Harry Hopkins on Ritz-Carlton stationery in his own hand right before he left for Europe, in which he said, to Hopkins, dear Harry, with big, bold, round handwriting. And he goes through, I'm leaving, and I'm going to report to you. I'm going to tell you everything. You know what's important to tell the big boss, or something like that. Well, if that was the way the chain of communication went, it's more than likely the big boss didn't hear about it or was dissuaded from it. Hopkins seemed to have those kinds of tendencies, as I note. Another blocked place. Another incident, a Reader's Digest correspondent named Theodore Mord. He was also, I think, an intelligence agent, maybe OSS, but it's a little unclear. He had another one of these arrangements. Now, it was again blocked. The reason they were blocked by communists is that these Germans were always not just anti-Hitler, they were anti-communist. And this is why they would be blocked by these people who were at various places. At the German desk in the OSS, for example, you had Franz Neumann, another agent. This is what was going on. When I say occupation, this is what I'm talking about. Alan Dulles, very famous, of course, he worked with this German underground and wrote a book about it, which is where I started reading about it, called Germany's Underground. Again, he made it very clear that their flaw was being anti-communist, because at a certain point it becomes very clear that our alliance with Stalin was more important than anything, even ending the war earlier. And if we think about it, Earl thought the war could have been possibly brought to a close in 1943, so did General Wiedemeyer, who's one of our strategists. That's before millions of people, Jews, other Europeans, cities had been destroyed, and before the Red Army was outside of Russia. So this is where we see the motivation in terms of, if you were a Soviet agent, you want Soviet Union to move into Europe. And this is what I started looking for. But again, this wasn't what I set out to research. But this is what you start to see when you start looking at this world in terms of concealment versus exposure. The fact is, Soviet Union had embarked on a dirty intelligence war against us from the moment it came to power in 1917, but it did so in American isolation. We had 4 presidents and 6 secretaries of state who refused to recognize it. It was a revolutionary entity. They basically said, they had various reasons, but they all agreed, you can't have normal relations with something that wants to overthrow you. Sound familiar? I mean, this is, again, we're looking again at parallels with Islam in terms of wanting to supplant the Constitution. Well, so did Communist Russia. Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union on November 16, 1933, and I came to think of that date as America's fall. Because months earlier, in Russia, we had had the end of what we know as the terror famine in the Ukraine. 5, 6, maybe more, millions of people forcibly starved to death by Stalin. And 6 months later, America normalizes relations? I mean, think of it in terms of, you have to scramble history some, but imagine if a country, after 6 million Jews were killed in Germany, 6 months later said, we'll normalize relations. I mean, it's a moral abomination, but we don't think about it in those terms. We never compare the ideologies, we don't compare the behaviors, and again, we learn to stop looking. And when you actually look at what the agreement was for the Soviet Union and America to normalize, essentially it was a list of promises that the Soviet Union would not support cadres of secret agents inside the United States to overthrow the Constitution. And everybody signed on the dotted line. And they said, we're normal. But, of course, that was already going on, and it only got worse. So in other words, our relationship was always predicated on a big lie. And in order to keep the relationship going, you had to keep lying. You had to keep not looking. You had to keep making things up. This is where we get to my subtitle, which is The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character, because I think that this does something to us, this kind of institutional lying. You see the double standards arise, you see a loosening on grasp on morality, reality, which I think is related. Because again, we're looking at the dirty work of these agents, these currents of thought. So now where are we? Now we know this happened, but we still have a disconnect. We haven't really admitted that it happened. We still have this incredible war on our country, this secret war on our country by many Americans, traitors. It happened, we have it in black and white, and yet the worst man in American history is Senator Joe McCarthy. I mean, how do we balance that? How do we say that that makes sense? How do we say it's logical and not ideological? So this is kind of what I was looking at. I was looking at letters, I was looking at memoirs, newspapers, old books that you can buy really, really cheaply at bookfinder.com, a little plug. You can get, these out-of-print books for very little money, and I found them fascinating because they have been left out of our story. One of them was a memoir by Robert Stripling, who was the lead investigator for the House Un-American Activities Committee, which in certain audiences I would probably hear boos at this point for even mentioning the name. Stripling was the lead investigator, and he wrote this memoir, and I just want to read to you how he described the suffering of being a truth teller. He said, "I want to tell in detail the price that men must pay for the dubious privilege of being reviled in print and on the air, for their labors in what amounts to a necessary sewer project of communist investigations." And he goes on to describe it. He says that his book is an attempt to outline, without conjecture, the scope of the communist conspiracy against the government and people of the United States, even though, and here's where it gets very important to me, he says, even though to do so is to invite the charge of fascist, red baiter, witch hunter, smear artist. To fail to do so is to capitulate to a resourceful enemy who can endure any counterattack except exposure. So again, this theme, this notion that hiding things versus trying to expose them. Now, who was hiding things? Well, for the most part, it was the left. So hiding things became the virtue. Trying to expose things, you were the smear artist. I mean, it was a real flim-flam game that was very, very effective. Now, how can I say all these things? I guess I'll mention the mechanism of the book goes much to the notion of how the archives opened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. At a certain point, we had this opening, scholars went in, they pulled documents out, helter-skelter, selectively, archives shut, Putin comes in. In the mid-90s here, after the opening and under Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the new Russia, we get Winona. And what is Winona? Winona, of course, are the cables that Western Union copied. They were Soviet embassy cables back to Moscow, and they were copied by Western Union, by government order, beginning in 1939 with the Nazi-Soviet pact. They were in code, they piled up, it must have filled rooms because there were hundreds of thousands of these things by the end of World War II, and they sat there untouched until 1943, when the government decided it'd be really nice to know what Stalin really would like us to do and be a better ally. Let's translate those Winona cables. So they started translating them, and they found out they were not diplomatic cables at all. They were intelligence cables, they were espionage cables, and there were these cryptonyms, these code names of people working for Stalin in our government. That's what they discovered, and they started trying to unravel it. That's an important archive. We have the Matrokin archive, came out in the 90s when a KGB archivist named Matrokin, he'd been copying and burying it in his garden or something, and he gets out with his archives. And later we get the Vasiliev archives, another KGB FSB in later years, man who copied. He was allowed in, copied. At a certain point, Putin didn't want him to do it anymore, and he fled with his archive. And we also have FBI files. And the FBI files are the declassified files that after about 50 years start coming out very heavily redacted. You can hardly read them. It's incredible, the redaction. But you can still get things from them. So I'm looking at this work done by all these great intelligence historians. And I am a journalist, I'm not a historian. But what I discovered was that historians, general historians, biographers, Soviet experts, they had never reconciled the findings of those intelligence archives with the general historical story. In other words, they'd never taken the confirmation of American officials acting for Stalin's behalf during these years and even decades and put it into what we know. It was separate. So I could come along after the thousands of books and things that had been written about World War II and the Cold War. I could do something new. I mean, it's crazy, but it was true. It has not really been done in any systematic fashion. And this is where you get the theme of American betrayal, because you start understanding, at a certain point, you start understanding that Uncle Sam is covering up for the Russian bear, and it's very disturbing. Today, are we saying Uncle Sam is covering up for Islam? We support jihadists across the Middle East. Can we not wonder? We eradicate the study of jihad in Washington security agencies, whether they're domestic or military. As we eradicate the study of jihad, it's very ironic. We also see the vacuuming up of everyone's records to compensate, perhaps. But the parallels, again, become very striking. In March 1943, the Soviet ambassador actually comes to the State Department with a list of anti-communist State Department officials. No one's laughing. Anti-communist State Department officials, they were there, asked for them to be purged. Take them away, send them out of Washington, take them off the Russia desk, take the Russia desk and destroy it, take the files, distribute them, shred them, get rid of them. It happened. It's an extraordinary thing, but what do we do when in 2011, we have 57 Muslim groups, many of them, some of them, notable some of them, Muslim Brotherhood front groups, write to John Brennan, then President Obama's counterterrorism chief. Is that for John Brennan or, for yeah, thank you. True, but what they asked for was a purge. They actually used the word, a purge of anti-Islamic training materials, of trainers, of re-educating trainers, that's another word they use, re-educate them, and punish them if they're not cooperating. This was done.
And banning?
I'm sorry?
Banning?
Banning. Thank you.
And Daniel, Steve Emerson and Daniel.
Well, banning many people. We can get to that in... Right, they name many people, and we can get to that afterwards. But this is the kind of parallel that you start to see and becomes increasingly disturbing. There are many of these. So you have to ask yourself, are we capitulating on an ideological level? Again, yes, of course we are, but once we called it victory, are we going to do that again? Or 20 years from now, are we going to talk about this wonderful victory in this period? And then you go back again and you re-examine notions of victory and you say, well, what kind of victory is it that replaces one totalitarian monster with another one? I mean, we replace Hitler with Stalin. That's victory, that's the good war, that was a good thing. I mean, it's kind of, you look at it and you think, why didn't I ever think of that before? We claim victory in the Cold War after the century where we have about 100 million people killed in communist regimes. And now we have a Republican Congress that cannot vote to defund socialized medicine. Now, we never say socialized medicine. Again, why? Why don't we say these words? It's very bizarre. We have the Senate, just in the last week or two, has decided our border is not sovereign, nothing to think about, our citizenship is cheaper than cheap, our Constitution is in tatters. And then you start seeing, do you see this sort of Marxist-Leninist thing emerging? I mean, that's what, all these things start to fit together in very disturbing ways. Now, in 1958, General Wiedemeyer wrote a very interesting memoir that I cite, and he wrote, "The irony of it all is that the Soviet Empire is largely one of our own creation." Well, this is true, and this is something I go through in great detail in the book. I would also argue that the Soviet Empire took place in our minds as well, over here. This is something that happened even as we thought we had the upper hand. We see the lies, we see the increasing complicity in Soviet crimes, we see the silencing of the truth tellers, and remember that moral fall in 1933. And I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think this did have the impact of releasing a grasp on morality, on logic, on reality. And it's kind of interesting when you go back and try to assemble the markers. Shortly after World War II ended, the noted military correspondent Hanson Baldwin, he was a New York Times correspondent, he was an excellent journalist, he wrote a slim book that I cite called Great Mistakes of the War. And when I first read the book, I was so new to this that I didn't know what they could possibly be. I mean, what mistakes? There were no mistakes. And it was very interesting to go through what he listed. He only has 4, it's a slim book. And number 1 is that the Soviet Union had abandoned its policy of world revolution. And number 2 is that Uncle Joe, in quotes, Uncle Joe was a good fellow, someone we could get along with. These are not military mistakes. These are, in fact, none of them are. The other two aren't either. These are all mental. They're all delusional. They are all the results of propaganda, conditioning. They are all big lies. They are all big lies. We had complete wartime censorship at the time. There was an office, an agency that came up called the Office of War Information. When you start looking, you take your Winona record and your Matrokin archive and your this and your that. I had them all spread open, and I'm looking and I'm going through names of olden days, listings of who was in these agencies that different scholars have put together. You have cadres of Soviet agents on various desks. It's extraordinary. I actually go through and list as many as I could find from the various sources to show that our wartime information was utterly controlled by Moscow. It wasn't just pro-Soviet, it was Soviet. That's what I mean by occupation. So we, the American people, were told by officials of the US government that the Soviet Union had abandoned its policy of world revolution, that Uncle Joe was a small d Democrat we could get on with, that there was religious freedom, and so on. I mean, does this sound familiar in terms of the kinds of propaganda we get today about Islam? Very common themes. We are told that jihad is personal struggle, not global jihad, that Islamic Sharia is perfectly compatible with the Bill of Rights. I mean, absolute big lie. Again, this is the pattern that we had. It's interesting even that in olden days, there was fear of offending the Russians that you read about and you think, I actually was not expecting to find that. The fear, of course, of offending Muslims is just people walk around on eggs, particularly in Washington. But the fear of offending the Russians was a huge restraint on policy making, on war making, on self-survival, and on. Often came up, don't offend the Russians. Very amazing parallel. So anyway, this is some of the structure and thematic structure of the book. And this is, it's a little over 400 pages. There are 961 endnotes. My editor said you have to have that many because no one will believe what you're saying if you don't have that many endnotes. They're very, very small print, but they're all there. So one of my first interviews actually ended up going 3 hours, believe it or not, on an internet radio station where you can do things like that. And at the end of hour 3, I got an email from a man who'd listened to the whole thing. And he gave me one sentence. He said, essentially, you are saying that all post-1930 American World War II and Cold War history, as it has been presented, is a fiction. And I thought, after all that work, all those pages, all those footnotes, all those hours, yes. I'm trying to explain how that could be, why it happened, and also how hard it is to untell these lies. The pushback comes from the left. They cannot stand the unraveling of Roosevelt and the socialist state he fostered. But it also comes from the right. It comes from the establishment that doesn't want to reveal the silence, the complicity. There's too much shared guilt. It goes on. Too much subversion, too much deception, too much involvement. And at a certain point, I realized that there had not been celebration in the sense you would expect in 1989, 90, that period where it was all falling apart, dissolution, dissolving in 1991. There was not this sense of triumph. There was too much shared responsibility for what had gone on, the appeasement, the silence. You start to understand it. And I would just say that I learned something interesting from Stanton Evans. You may know who he is. He is an American treasure. He is a great journalist and historian. He wrote Blacklisted by History in 2007, which was his book about Joseph McCarthy that essentially flips the history through primary sources. He doesn't listen to the smears. He goes out and he finds his own archive of primary documents to tell a very different story. And I've told him many times I consider that book really the Rosetta Stone for mine. It just led me right into continuing essentially this revision. But he told me, he was very generous during, with his time when I would call him with questions, and he told me that at a certain point when you go back to a document that you read early in your research, after you've learned new things, it will always look different. It will always make sense in a different way. And at a certain point, this anecdote I'm going to tell you that Vladimir Bukovsky told became very clear to me. And he wrote, Vladimir Bukovsky was a former dissident. He was a prisoner of psychiatric hospitals at the end of the Soviet Union. And in about 2008, he wrote an essay about his experiences inside the Soviet archives after the fall of the Soviet, or dissolution of the Soviet Union, when Boris Yeltsin had asked him to assemble a case against communism to try in a Nuremberg-style manner. And Bukovsky's in there copying these archives. I think they all knew, everyone who went in could not believe it would continue, and they all came out with their own copies of things. He was in there doing it. At a certain point, Yeltsin came to him and said, "It's over. I don't want you to continue. We're not going to go forward with this. I'm getting too much pressure from the West." And when I first read this, I would say I read this in 2008, and before I'd done this research, and I just thought, I don't understand that. I don't really get that. It's interesting. I'm sure he's telling the truth. It's just odd. But I think as you go through this book, and certainly as I went through my research, I understood that elites, anyway, do not want to know the truth. They want the phony narratives. They're more important to them than the truth itself. They're more important to them than the country, certainly than the truth tellers, the men at war. This manipulation of the people, in a sense, is the greatest betrayal. Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote once in evident frustration, "It is as if the West actually does not want to know the truth until the moment when this knowledge has ceased to be of use." Now, I'm hoping he's wrong. I'm hoping we can learn these truths, because even if they break our hearts, and there is much in this book that will break hearts, the truth is dear to us. It is important to us. Shows us what can happen when it is lost, the deception the government can put over us, how false narratives are written, how lives are wasted, how truth tellers are marginalized and forgotten. And they also show us what we're going through again today. It is happening again. And I guess that, in a sense, is what you hope serves as some kind of a wake-up call and call to action in American Betrayal. And I would like to also thank you now for your very kind attention. Thank you.
Perhaps I misunderstood you, but I was around during World War II, and without the Soviets on our side, we would have lost the war, because everyone, I think people who were around at that time know that the war was won on American money and arms and Russian blood.
Well, I think that may be what everyone knows, but what I'm trying to put across is that there is other evidence of very different currents running, of very different strategies running, and it's a long story, it's in the book, but I would say the most important point that may address your concern has to do with the fact that America and Britain single-mindedly wanted to stop Hitler, wanted to overthrow Hitler Germany. The Soviet Union wanted to supplant Hitler. They had a completely different strategy going even as we were allies. That certainly is the story, and it's increasing, I would say, in recent years, this notion that the Soviet blood won the war. I do disagree. I think there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, but the most important thing to understand, the three main allies in Europe did not have common goals. Britain and America wanted to destroy Hitler. Stalin wanted to take his place, and he did.
What was Roosevelt's knowledge of all these agents? How immersed
Good
was
question.
he in the plot?
Good question. The question was, what was Roosevelt's knowledge of these agents? Was he in the plot? This is a unsolvable riddle, and I actually was quite relieved at a certain point to realize that Roosevelt scholars, because again, I'm coming at this sort of as a citizen journalist more than a specialist, they don't know. Roosevelt was inscrutable to the point where Robert Sherwood, the very famous biographer of Harry Hopkins, and he was a speechwriter in the White House, he was a great writer, fantastic career in Hollywood and Broadway as well. He actually referred to not knowing what was going on in Franklin Roosevelt's heavily forested interior. Gives you an idea. He was fairly inscrutable. However, there are two things to understand about Roosevelt vis-a-vis the manipulation. I think he was a dupe. I think he was not the brightest bulb out there. I think he was power mad and very worshipful of Stalin. I think those things are things we can see from the record. When you get to understanding his relationship with these people who turn out to be agents, I think very often he was manipulated. He always had to have someone with him, like a Harry Hopkins, who actually lived in the White House for 3.5 years, in the family quarters, breakfast, lunch, and dinner with Roosevelt. He also was increasingly, I'm not exaggerating, he was increasingly to a point of brain dead toward the end of the war. He was a very, very sick man, and that was hidden from us as well. I mentioned Stanton Evans. He has a wonderful new book out that in some ways is kind of a companion piece to mine called Stalin's Secret Agents. He writes about many episodes of agenting. We actually don't overlap, which is interesting, but he goes into chapter and verse on the state of Roosevelt, who was essentially, certainly by the time you get to Yalta, like this. People would show him papers, and in their memoirs, they never come out and tell us, the people who need to know this information, but in memoirs, we hear about him staring vacantly. He would say he didn't remember signing things, such as the Morgenthau Plan, which some of you know it was a very important plan to, quote, pastoralize Germany that essentially drove the Germans into even more resistance and probably caused the breakout we know as the Battle of the Bulge. He said that was rescinded. He said he had no knowledge of signing it. He didn't know what he was looking at. At Yalta, you had, again, Alger Hiss. Contrary to the story we are told, very much in control of the agenda, which we find out from notes, again, in Stanton Evans' book, selling his book too tonight. And this was essentially a figurehead at this point, certainly as you get on in the war. There are times, however, where you see him make a decision on his own that was in American interest and drove Harry Hopkins and General Marshall, who was Army Chief of Staff at the time, nuts. Anytime Roosevelt got off their kind of agenda, they acted as if he was insubordinate to them. It's a very strange dynamic when you start reading the minutes. I go through quite a lot of that as well. So I think that he was not the brains behind any of this. I think that he was happy with it. I think one other point, which is interesting and important, he believed he was not an ideological man, which is an interesting thing. I mean, he didn't really have that much strong views. He kind of was obviously supervising a very socialistic agenda and collectivist agenda and economic planning, all that, but it was more in response to his own advisors and so on, and again, riding the currents of power. But one thing he did seem to believe in was something called convergence. I've always thought this was kind of like a 1970s Zen type of thing where communism and capitalism would converge in something, which actually has happened. That is where we are. He believed it in the 30s, and I don't know if it was his own idea or, again, it was given to him, but he believed that the Soviet Union would become a bit more free and that we would become more rigidly controlled by central government. So in that sense, I think he was willing to forgive Stalin crimes in order to get to this better place.
I was wondering if maybe in your research you saw any evidence to the fact that Winston Churchill may have been less keen on Stalin than FDR. And my qualification is I recently read, I'm not an expert on anything, but I recently read a book called Letters from Winston Churchill, and it went through a lot of the letters through, at the end of it was the trilateral meeting between Stalin, FDR, and Winston Churchill. And they were supposed to have dinner or meetings together, and there was several occasions during these days where FDR ended up taking meetings with Stalin, where Winston Churchill was not included, and he was none too happy. Right. And there was a lot of other things where he wrote that he did not like what was going on with Stalin.
That's a good question as well. Yes, Churchill, He goes hot and cold on Stalin. Certainly at the beginning, he is doing his bidding in the sense of going back to Katyn Forest Massacre when Stalin wanted to blame the Nazis for that crime that he had committed. Churchill went along with that. He, even to the point of writing to Stalin, it's a disturbing note about, oh, we will silence the Polish press in England. They had free Polish government centered in England at the time, and he was offering to essentially censor them for saying, you know, the wrong thing. So he was playing the Stalin card at certain points. At the time of the Tehran Conference, which was the first Big Three conference at the end of 1943, Churchill realizes what's going on and how Europe is going to be taken by Stalin. And this is a moment of great upset to him, but at a certain point he's essentially powerless. I mean, World War II destroyed the British Empire, just bankrupted England. Again, you know, this was not a victory in that sense. Churchill was very hostile to Stalin. I mean, to Churchill. FDR became quite tired of Churchill at a certain point later in the war as well. He didn't like British imperialism. Why Soviet imperialism was okay, mystery. And so, you know, there is definite tension there. But at a certain point, Britain is a supplicant nation and needs American credits just like everyone else.
Conventional wisdom is that Joe McCarthy was a loose cannon and accused people randomly of being a communist. It's something I lived through on the East Coast, which is predominantly liberal and Democrat. Is Joe McCarthy a true American hero?
Yes. I think he's the most maligned man in American history. You have to understand, again, this was a dirty intelligence war that was being covered up and manipulated by agents, fellow travelers, dupes, useful fools, the whole bit, in an echo chamber of media. And people who tried to get their arms around it, either the great investigators who became the symbolic head of them, Joe McCarthy, or the great witnesses like Whittaker Chambers, Elizabeth Bentley, some of the defectors like Viktor Kravchenko and others, in order to get above the static, they had to be loud, they had to be brash, they had to be not normal, like most people. Most people don't want to go out into the world of you know, battle. It's battle. They'd rather live their lives and be normal. When you have truth by the, you know, the teeth and you're a bulldog about it, you are going to come across in ways that are not considered polite or normal. Now, I'm not saying that these people all were not, you know, polite people, but to get through it, they often would exhibit these traits and, of course, be magnified and distorted in the media. I don't believe anyone can name one person that Joe McCarthy smeared who was innocent. It's a challenge that I know Stanton Evans, who wrote the book, always puts out there, and nobody can come up with one. I'm not a McCarthy scholar, but that is the canard. What he did do, for example, was go back to a scandal known as the Amerasia scandal, which was a scandal that happened in 1945, where the FBI unmasked a huge espionage ring that was very important and instrumental in the eventual turning of China red and the complete abdication or the abandonment of Chiang Kai-shek, who was the nationalist leader of China at the time. And this particular scandal came up, was airtight, evidence, pounds of it. I mean, I can't remember if it was thousands or hundreds, but I mean lots and lots of pounds of evidence of all kinds of malfeasance, officials, State Department officials implicated, White House officials implicated. There was a grand jury that was essentially thrown by the Justice Department at this point under Harry Truman, and it's a tremendous scandal and very fascinating. However, nobody was indicted. The whole thing disappeared. China turned red. 5 years later or so, one of the things Joseph McCarthy did was go back to Amerasia and actually bring it out. And I know one thing Stanton Evans writes in his book, that if Joe McCarthy had only done one thing, Amerasia, in terms of setting the record straight and bringing people to at least justice in the public record, he would deserve the plaudits of a grateful nation. this is just one thing. He was the most maligned person who has ever lived, and you have to ask yourself, why? You know, why this one person? Why is he so much worse? He was effective. He was beloved. It's an amazing thing. He was one of the most popular men in America in 1954, which would become the same year that he fell. It's a fascinating story, and I actually feel he's very important symbolically, because I feel that if you can switch the thinking, if you can ask people to be logical and go back to the record and understand what Joseph McCarthy did, was trying to do, and what people who were trying to do to kill him, you know, in political terms and perhaps later on, it's almost like that's where the switch is in terms of the moral inversion, and the record falls into place in a more logical and virtuous fashion.
Given your well-documented history of lies and cover-ups over the past 80 years, I have a more organic question, which is, why should we trust any of our government officials, certainly congressmen, senators, and presidents, who over 80 years have lied to us, whether they were Republican, Democratic, Independent, or Communist? Why should we trust any of them?
Well, I don't think we should. But that said, that isn't to say that there isn't anyone worth trusting, but I think, again, you can't listen to the echo chamber, you can't listen to the platitudes. You know, when the president is acting unconstitutionally, he must be called on it. When the Congress is failing to do its job and investigate it, they must be called on it. They must be, I mean, it's sort of like, you know, you have to get back to this very organic we the people notion, but no, they should not be trusted. But one of the things you find increasingly is this, and this is, I think, why we are losing our liberties, is you find this increasing acquiescence to authority figures, whether they're TSA people or whether they're figures in Washington or in the media. If they say it, and it's on a television screen, people believe it, or people act like they believe it, or don't even think about it. So I think that, you know, there's just an organic, to use your word, you know, kind of problem with where we've come.
There's what we call Realpolitik. Sometimes you have to make alliances with bad guys. Roosevelt's famous statement when somebody said, you're dealing with sons of bitches, and he says, yeah, but there are sons of bitches. For instance, you made a blanket condemnation of Islam, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with you. But there are many Islamic leaders who are lousy, but they're not major threats. Excuse me. The kings of Morocco and Jordan, the present leaders of Pakistan. Pakistan has an atomic bomb. If the radicals get control there, we are in very deep doo-doo, you know. Richard Nixon is praised even by his enemies for opening up our relations with China. Mao Zedong is the greatest. All right, the question is, aren't we sometimes forced to deal with bad guys and make deals with them? Sometimes we have to court them. Realpolitik requires that.
Well, it depends what your political goal is. I mean, I wouldn't tell you that there's never a time where you're going to deal with someone that is not a constitutional angel or something like that. However, we're not talking about just dealing with people when we have to. We're talking about getting into bed with them. We're talking about making deals, for example, not to develop our own energy, to make deals with Saudi Arabian dictatorships that continue to this day to handcuff our own energy production, to corrupt our colleges with tranches of money that are just beyond any matter of just simply dealing with people when you need to get through some sort of a canal or something that they control. I think that would be along the lines of dealing with people in terms of realpolitik. I mean, opening China is by no means a non-controversial policy point. I mean, it was extremely contentious at the time. We've forgotten that, but I mean, people actually left. I think William Buckley and some James Buckley, some other people actually left, stopped supporting Nixon over that, at least at the time. So it's not like, yes, we have a status quo in some of these issues, but in terms of a wide swath, I think that you can make ideological statements when an ideology is absolutely designed to destroy your own constitutional-based rule of law liberty. One thing I found very interesting when I was reading about some of these things was Robert Conquest, who is the nonpareil, historian of Soviet, extermination history. I mean, he's the man who codified and brought together our modern histories of the terror, famine, of the purges, and so on. A tremendous writer as well. He actually made this point that the Cold War was in no way a war of ideology, meaning the West did not have an ideology. Communism has an ideology. It has an absolute lexicon of what you can say and what you can think and where you're going and what the point is. In the West, we have rule of law, or we did. So this was not an ideological struggle. When you're looking at communism, it is designed to secretly subvert your system. When you're looking at Islam, it is, by virtue of its fulfilling its law, going to subvert your own system, going to destroy your system, going to take away your religious liberty, regardless of what the monarch of Morocco is about. That is just the ideological, religious, legal fact. So that would be why I would feel very comfortable making that argument. They cannot coexist in the same place.
Did the Soviet agents within have anything to do with stopping the army from trying to bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz or bomb the camps? Were they influenced in that? And the second part is the Soviets actually liberated the first concentration camp in Poland, and it was censored from the press.
Well, that may be. I don't know about that. As to your first question, the Soviets also waited on the banks of, during the Polish uprising, and waited for the Nazis to kill the Polish underground. That was something else they did. Just because they liberated a camp, I don't think gives them a claim on any particular virtue. But as to your first question, I cannot say. I don't know the answer to that question. I think that was, again, a Roosevelt very disturbing decision, not unconcerned, no concern for the camps. We did have planes, British and American, operating. I'm sure many of you know this probably better than I do, operating in the vicinity. This became actually a bone of contention and controversy at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, where the legend over some of these displays that talked about this particular incident were considered unduly harsh on Roosevelt. But this is part of his history. I don't know that communism or communist agents would have been at that juncture, so I can't answer that.
By the way, we would have just nuked Germany in the end. We didn't need the Russians. My question is to stay with Russia. From Center for American Progress and such, we got the argument, and this is an incompetence question. What's you've got the betrayal you spoke about, and then what is the role of incompetence, along with not wanting to give offense, along with not wanting to believe evil is evil, focusing on incompetence. The cap thinking was, well, gee, if we would just stop supporting Georgia on South Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and get those pesky anti-missiles out of Czechia and Poland, we'd get along great with Putin. Oops.
Yeah.
Reset the reset. In all this, we have betrayal, is gross, unbelievable, incredibly huge incompetence, the other side of the coin.
Sure, it's human. Certainly there's not like everyone's walking around with plans and marching orders. A lot of this does take on a momentum of its own, and certainly the nature of espionage, the most important aspect of espionage, which is not what we see dramatized for sure in books and movies. It is not just stealing secrets and plans and battle plans. It is influence. Influence is the most, I think, the most dangerous aspect of espionage, and it is not usually taught. Deception, disinformation. So incompetence would feed into that just in terms of the human failings, but in terms of just moving events, influencing events. Another role would be getting certain people into key roles, protecting people from security investigations. This happened again and again. These kinds of factors also play in. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes their plans go awry. I mean, none of this is an exact science. None of this is a color by numbers kind of thing. It's in flux. So yes, there are things that play into it: incompetence, irresponsibility, laziness, deception, purpose, drive. I mean, it's all there.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight. I think your book is an excellent blueprint for looking at this administration right now, especially when you look at a person such as Hopkins, Harry Hopkins. I would see Valerie Jarrett.
Yes.
And Tom Donilon figures in there. It's like the same people that you were describing that's been held back from us is playing out right now, and I think because we don't know our history, it's not there. So the question is, has anyone else come up to you and said, oh, Valerie Jarrett, oh, yes. Tom Donilon, oh, and start naming all these horrible people?
Yes, well, actually,
and I need you to sign my book too. I've already.
Of course. Yes, people have mentioned Valerie Jarrett. I mean, it isn't. Yes, I mean, these patterns do replay, and I guess it probably has something to do with the nature of the presidency, the role of the president, who is very often in tandem with a very super powerful advisor, someone who is not answerable to the people. So you're correct in that. And the Hopkins thing is kind of interesting because in circles of academia, where most of this original research in terms of the archival research goes, they're on the left, instinctively or not, or just of the left. They may not be extremely politically motivated, but they tend to default toward this protection of Roosevelt. And what you actually see, which I'm experiencing already, even though the book's only about a month or so old, is this sort of circling of the wagons in terms of only wanting to continue to uncover the same old people, the Harry Dexter Whites or the Alger Hisses, not really wanting to go into the implications of the notion that Harry Hopkins may well have been a conscious agent living in the White House, influencing many things, influencing many policies, along with Lachlan Curry and Michael Greenberg and people like Harry Dexter White and Solomon Adler and Cedric Balfour. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. There are just so many of them. But they don't really want to go to the point where they're understanding this as an occupation. Today, we have President Obama, came up through a whole coterie of radicals, beginning with Franklin Marshall Davis, communist organizer on an FBI list to be arrested in the event of war with the United States and Soviet Union at the time. And I found this kind of interesting when I was looking at this after that first election when Obama came into office. Paul Kengor was also a historian in these same areas. He wrote a very good book called Dupes. He was writing about the fact that Americans could not really recognize the radicalism of President Obama the first time around, or the second time around, but he was writing it the first time. And he said he thought, he's a professor, and he thought it was because students are not taught about communism. They're not taught about the Constitution. They're not taught about the differences. They don't know they don't know when something's unconstitutional at all, and they don't know when something threatens liberty. And again, it's this notion of Uncle Joe's okay, communism is compatible, it's just another way, Islam is a religion of peace. I mean, it's the same kinds of pabulum. Yeah.
Vladimir Lenin said that in order to establish communism, the most important thing is to establish a central bank. You control currency, you control all of industry, which is the end game. Do you think not renewing the charter of our central bank could potentially get rid of all the problems like immoral politicians, people that support realpolitik? You take that out of their hands if you take away the money. They can't fund Obamacare because they can't print their way to funding it. Do you think it's possible to get rid of the betrayal if you just get rid of the central bank?
Maybe. It's kind of a tall order. I think that any measures of central control beget this kind of betrayal. And I think the money one is extremely important. And I'm not a scholar of that, but you go back to that and you see the founding families involved and where they end up, in the succeeding generations. It is another disturbing pattern of betrayal. All central control does engender this kind of corruption, this kind of disregard for people. And I was very struck by something that a fellow writer, Jonah Goldberg, who wrote a very good book a few years ago, I'm blanking on the name. I'm sure people, yeah, liberal fascism, of course. But he said recently there was a discussion, there's some article I haven't read about Washington as a company town or something like that. I haven't read it. But he made a comment about it, and he said it's not a company town in the sense that it makes widgets and sells them. It's a company town in the sense that it takes money by force from people and tells them how to live their lives. I live in Washington. I thought, oh, that's true. That's what it is. And it's, again, this notion of this central hold on us.
You need to talk about Hollywood. Thousands of movies and television shows over the last 50, 60 years about the evil Nazis. Nothing about the communists.
Right.
100 million people
Right.
killed by the communists in the 20th century.
Good
and
point.
Hollywood couldn't care less.
Right.
In fact, a lot of Hollywood supported those killings.
Right. Well, you're very.
That's the truth.
You're right. You're right. And there's actually a fairly substantial Hollywood section in the book. My dad was a Hollywood writer. This is a subject of great interest to me. That is correct. And the vacuum on drama, the story of the 20th century, the absolute censoring or shutdown of stories, human interest stories involving the advent of communism, the fight against communism, the escape from communism, all these things, does not exist in our movie libraries. It's not there. There are very, very few movies where you will see this kind of a drama. I think I mentioned about 5. Never Let Me Go with Clark Gable was a wonderful movie after the war made about an American trying to bring his Soviet wife out, but that's a very unusual movie. Another thing you don't see, with all the 100 million people killed, there are 1 or 2 instances where you will ever see Red Army atrocities. They don't exist. They're not there. And so what does that do to us? I think it cheats us, in many, many ways. Solzhenitsyn wrote about this notion of not telling the truth, making all literature invalid. And he was talking about the Soviet Union, where, of course, if you broke the code, you went to the Gulag. What happened here? This was Lotus Land, and this was not a gulag. It might be a career gulag or a cocktail party gulag, but that's not really the same thing. And you really do see this vacuum. You also see the one thing I talk about also in the book has to do with the blacklist, the dread blacklist. Well, before we go to someone like Dalton Trumbo, member of the Hollywood 10, blacklisted, martyred, according to the mythology. Well, Dalton Trumbo was a blacklister before he blacklisted. And what I'm talking about is in 1946, he wrote an article in the Daily Worker where he discussed, no, you're not, comrades, no, you're not going to see a whole lot of Marxist ideology in the movie script. However, our great achievement is that we have managed to keep such vile anti-communist works, such as Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, or Trotsky's biography of Stalin, and he went on to name some other books. John Valtine had a famous novel about Nazism and communism. We have kept these from the movie screen, and that is our achievement. And again, when you start looking at the filmography, that's exactly what it is. It's not there. However, the Nazis are still there. We had a 12-year Reich, and they remain the villains throughout the rest of the century to this day, whereas the communists, nothing. It's really kind of an amazing exercise in mind control, and when you actually start looking at the filmographies, it's pretty astonishing and very, very disappointing, and I've actually grown quite weary of even the great World War II movies because I realize they do become vehicles of propaganda, and it's very clear, and when you start understanding Harry Hopkins' role in Hollywood, he was very influential as well, and there was a very famous movie, Mission to Moscow, which was a romanticization of the show trials. They called it Submission to Moscow, the WAGs. It was that bad. It was such a egregious whitewash of what was going on in Russia. These were very important movies, and the White House was involved.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming out here and talking. What have you found out about the infiltration of our medical system, especially when you look in the mental health field and you look at how the Soviets involuntarily committed people for political views, and then you see today there was a veteran who was involuntarily committed to a mental institution after he criticized President Obama
Oh,
on
boy.
Facebook.
I haven't heard that story. That's really horrible news. I have not studied that area. It sounds like it should be studied and brought to light. Thank you for mentioning it. I'll look it up, but I don't have anything to add to that. Incredible. Terrifying.
Diana, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Going back to McCarthy, my question is, oddly enough, do you think he could have done it differently? Because at the time when the blacklist came out, the hearings came out, all of Hollywood panicked. And the heads of the big studios looked to see purging, looked to purging those people who were accused of having communist sympathies. And so much of the time it was one of these, kind of pin-headed intellectual interests in something new that's around the corner, i.e. communism. Didn't amount to anything. But so many people lost their jobs. And you fast forward now, I mean, you're talking about Zero Mostel had to go underground, of course, Dalton Trumbo, but I understand later he reneged on his communist beliefs. Elia Kazan actually, quote, named names, and he remains a figure of hatred among a lot of the Hollywood left today.
Sure.
And this was all because of that. Roll forward to the present day, and you've got a left-wing blacklist against people in Hollywood who are on the right. So I'm wondering if there wasn't a different way that it could have been approached way back in the day, so we're not still actually feeling the effects of all that.
Well, to begin with, Joseph McCarthy had nothing to do with the Hollywood 10. The Hollywood hearings were in the House in the 1940s, and McCarthy was doing his hearings in the Senate, non-Hollywood hearings starting in 1950. So this actually is not one that we can pin on him in any way. But I think that there's some facts need to sort of come out that may put this into better perspective, namely the blacklisting and the naming of names are obviously, a separate thing. And if we talk about Elia Kazan, I think he expressed it extremely well, as did Edward Dmytryk, another Hollywood 10 person. And this was that when they decided to come back to the committee and discuss the communist experiences that they had had, or the people they knew who were communists and working for Stalin in their way, they realized that what they were doing was breaking silence of a mob, like a mafia-style silence. Dmytryk writes about this. What he realized was that this was, in a sense, he was being asked to keep omerta, the mob term for silence, against a conspiracy of people who wanted to overthrow the Constitution. And he came to realize that there was no glory in that, there was no goodness in that this was something that needed to be exposed. Kazan wrote very similarly, very movingly in his memoir, where he wrote about, I actually quote them both in my book, I don't have the words exactly, but he wrote about the fact that he had plenty against the committee, but he decided to discuss what he knew and name names because he knew that communism was different, was not another political party. It was a conspiracy to overthrow the country, and he felt absolutely not honor-bound to promote the conspiracy. When we fast forward to Kazan getting his special Oscar in 1999, and he was utterly slammed all over again as about a 90-year-old man, I think he was at the time, for having named names, quote unquote. It was as if, again, sort of a moral inversion of who is the good guy here. He was the good guy trying to protect the Constitution, trying to protect freedom of speech, liberty to think what you like. That is the opposite of the communist program that has been sold to us as the sort of free-thinking liberal line. It is an utter inversion of reality. And when he had to sneak into the theater to get his special Oscar to avoid protesters, after a century where you had just had 100 million people killed by this wonderful ideology, again, we're looking at this utter inversion of reality again that has been utterly successful. But I don't think there was any other way really to do it. This was something so foreign to America. I mean, I'm sure mistakes were made. Some people were probably more caught up in the careerism aspect of it, or were party to, certain foibles and so on. But in terms of trying to understand that America had been infiltrated by agents of Stalin in our our creative industry, in our government, these were people from the Midwest, from around the country, trying to figure out what is this, who are these people, what's going on in the open. And, this notion of taking the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, it got absolutely ridiculous. You had spies up there who had photographic equipments in their basements taking the Fifth Amendment, saying they didn't want to say whether they'd ever been in their basement to avoid incriminating themselves. That actually happened. That got Nathan Silvermaster. It is such a scramble that we have. Indeed, McCarthy is blamed for it. He wasn't involved in it. But this notion that they were somehow true to some sort of higher calling by conspiring with Stalin to overthrow the Constitution is just an utter inversion of, I think, what most people would consider patriotic.
Can you comment on Ronald Reagan and how he maintained his reputation as an anti-communist in Hollywood?
I'm sorry, what was?
Can you comment on Ronald Reagan and how he maintained his reputation as an anti-communist in Hollywood and later?
Well, he was an anti-communist in Hollywood. He became an anti-communist in Hollywood. In terms of my Hollywood section, I don't address Ronald Reagan. I find him quite significant in what he tells us about the state of our understanding of good and evil when he comes about in 1983 and in passing calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. This brought down such opprobrium onto him for describing the Soviet Union as an evil empire. It was much more concerned about him using the terminology than the fact that the empire was evil. This was sort of where we were, again, this inversion of what is good and what is bad. It's incredible. It should have been a very trite observation at this point, very banal, but it was considered opening the floodgates of hell to mention it. And this sort of gave us a reading on the temperature of our moral sense. But in terms of the Hollywood thing, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking.
What I was asking is, he maintained a good reputation that wasn't trampled the way McCarthy was.
Well, he was we look on him. No, I think certainly McCarthy, Ronald Reagan was not conducting investigations and actually exposing spy rings and things like that. So he was not a power broker at the time. So I think that the effectiveness of McCarthy in this period made him into a lightning rod, whereas Ronald Reagan, who was a beloved actor, I certainly think he had his battles for being an anti-communist, and I'm sure suffered in his own career in that regard, but they had different levels of power at that time, so I think that would probably have excused him from this demonization.
First of all, I'm so impressed with everything that you've done and your writing and what you're saying. I think this is possibly one of the most important books written in the last 20 or 30 years.
Well, thank you.
Thank
you very much.
I really appreciate that. A couple of things. One, something of interest that I thought was interesting about when Elia Kazan got his award, and one of the only people that stood up and gave him a standing ovation during that award ceremony, the Oscars, was Warren Beatty, who had produced Reds, about John Reed, who had become incredibly disillusioned with communism. And I thought that was really interesting. Anyway, two quick things. One, I want to know what the reaction from what your book has been in anybody in terms of the mainstream media or Washington. Is anybody reading this book and reacting to it that can actually do anything? Number one. And number two, do you see anybody in Washington today that can draw these parallels and bring any of this to light that can begin the awakening or the opening up of America's eyes to the new threat that we're facing today?
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. In terms of reaction, I'm still waiting for reaction. I mean, it's relatively new. My first book, The Death of the Grown-Up, did get widely reviewed fairly quickly, and I don't know if I'm being ignored this time or if their reviews will come. But in terms of mainstream media, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and so on, I haven't had the reviews. Now, in these days, that's actually not necessary. It's not like the old publishing world where you had to have a New York Times, you know, in order to move forward. So I've had a good response in, you know, all of our alternative media, you know, various venues. I've done some you know, today was Glenn Beck, which was a very good alternative media. But I have not had any major arguments yet, except privately. I've had some, there's one scholar in particular who has been upset with what I've been writing about Harry Hopkins. But we have not had it out publicly, so I won't mention who it is yet, but I think we probably will. So I'm still waiting on that. And as to your second question had to do with the, who today? Well, you know, that is a really, really good question, and it's probably a good question for the last question as well, since we're looking toward the future. We are all creatures of our time, and our congressional people are as well. And certainly, I think I spend half my time when I write my column and such bemoaning the failures of Congress to understand how powerful they really are. I've started thinking of them as Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. If they just click their heels, they can do what they can realize that they have this tremendous power to subpoena witnesses, to call investigations, to all manner of they are the balance of power gives them these powers to both affect change and do more than just the way they oversight now. It's very ineffective. It's horribly impotent. And the less they do, the more the executive branch does, is what we are. So who can take the baton? There are some very good people. They have not been able to perform at a level that has been effective, however. We would talk about Michelle Bachmann, who simply for raising, yes, she's wonderful, she's retiring, simply for raising the question about Muslim Brotherhood penetration in the policymaking chain last summer. I'm sure many of you remember, she was utterly crucified. She was compared to McCarthy, which is death. You had Senator McCain denouncing her, John Boehner, Marco Rubio, I mean, on and on and on. Interestingly enough, I actually had some columns censored in one of my outlets, the Washington Examiner, which is now defunct, for talking about what Michelle Bachmann was trying to expose in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood penetration that she was asking inspectors general to look at. Now, that's simply asking inspector general at an agency like state to, for example, look into why Hillary Clinton's top aide, Huma Abedin, comes from the Muslim Brotherhood and has all manner of associations that should never have permitted her to get anywhere near a security clearance, just for asking the question. Now, in olden days, you would have had congressional chairmen, very much more powerful, hold hearings, like Big Bad Joe McCarthy, like Martin Dies of the House Un-American Activities Committee, like Pat McCarran, another Democrat, another investigator in the Senate, and so on, many others. So they don't do what they can do. We have Alan West, didn't return to Congress, unfortunately. Yes, a wonderful man, and someone I admire, but again, unable. I mean, I don't know where they gain their power. I'm very impressed with Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is wonderful. And there are some others in the Senate as well, Mike Lee, Rand Paul. But, you know, time will tell whether they can actually muster the votes and get through the static of the echo chamber and so on to try to mobilize people. So, you know, it's an open question, and we just have to keep trying and hoping.
Thank you again. Diana's book is available.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.